So I suppose, first of all, to refer to what's happening in Ireland, that might be a good place to start, and that we're undergoing a law reform process here to reform our exclusive way of dealing with situations where there's a question over legal capacity. And the only way that you can deal with that in Ireland at the moment is by way of wardship. And the Regulation of Lunacy Act 1871 regulates that, and that's still on the statute books. And it's a very antiquated and outdated way of responding to questions about legal capacity. And the Law Reform Commission did a body of work in the early noughties. They did 2 consultation papers on legal capacity, and that culminated in a report in 2006, which was published. And out of that report then, the Department of Justice, the civil side of the Department of Justice, published detailed heads of a bill in 2008. And that was very problematical, actually, because the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities emerged in 2006 and was opened up for signature in 2007. So the Law Reform Commission's work really hadn't taken account to any substantive degree of the UN Convention because it was so new. And our understanding of the concept of legal capacity has developed so much since 2006. You'll see there in the handout we gave you, we just outlined 3 approaches to legal capacity. And the first approach is what's referred to as the status approach. So traditionally what has happened, and this is certainly the situation with the warded court system, is that if there's a perception that you have a disability and you can't make a decision, you're automatically stripped of your ability to make decisions on the basis of your status. So it's very much a status approach, and that's wholly inappropriate. The second approach then is what's known as the outcome approach. And if you are a person with a disability and you make a bad decision or a series of bad decisions, then it's permissible for your legal capacity to be restricted or to be deprived. And both those approaches are now wholly inappropriate in light of international human rights law, in particular Article 12 of the CRPD. The third approach then is a more modern approach. It's called the functional approach to legal capacity, and it's a more of a flexible approach, and it kind of recognises that a person might be able to make a decision on one particular thing, but a person mightn't be able to make a decision on another thing. So somebody might be able to make a decision about what clothes they wear, but they mightn't be able to make a decision about their property and dispose of their property. And the functional approach is the approach that was adopted in the Law Reform Commission's report, but in light of Article 12, that has increasingly been seen as really inappropriate. If you look at the back page of the handout we gave you, you'll see there that there is Article 12 set out, and there is 5 subparts to Article 12. And Article 12 in those 5 parts deals with what the UN Convention, what international human rights law requires. And Part 1 actually, it's very run-of-the-mill, it's talking about legal capacity and equal recognition for the law. And Part 2 actually is very important in that it says that people with disabilities have the right to enjoy legal capacity on an equal basis with everybody else. And Part 3 then is really important, and it says that people are entitled to support in order to exercise their legal capacity. That's actually very important in that it introduces this, what's now referred to as supported decision-making. So it's different to the functional approach to legal capacity. It actually requires that you see what a person needs in order for them to make decisions, and that you can't deny them of their right to exercise decision-making and to exercise their legal capacity. And then Part 4 is very important. You'll see there's a reference in there to the will and preferences, and that's really important actually, because that actually really challenges the best interest approach, and the best interest approach is being the one that's dominated. It really emerged in relation to children in terms of acting in the best interest of the child, but it's really inappropriate in relation to adults, and it is very paternalistic, and it really is the approach that's adopted very often in relation to disability. So it's actually very problematical. And when Article 12 was being drafted, there was discussions about whether there should be a reference to best interests, and that was firmly rejected because it was very clearly said that best interest isn't an appropriate model in relation to people with disabilities around decision making. So there's a real challenge here for us in Ireland to modify the 2008 bill, because it's very much based on the functional approach, and it doesn't provide, the heads of the bill as published in 2008 don't provide for supporting people to make decisions, things like supported representation agreements from British Columbia, some of the Canadian ways of supporting people, reasonable accommodations, advocacy, those kind of supports aren't factored into the bill. So there's a real challenge around that in Ireland. What has been really interesting last year is that the CRPD committee, which is the committee that monitors state parties' compliance with the CRPD, they published their first 2 concluding observations in respect of hearings they had about Tunisia and Spain's compliance with the convention. And they made a really interesting statements around legal capacity, and they said in both of those concluding observations that Tunisia and Spain needed to move beyond guardianship, needed to move beyond even limited guardianship towards supported decision making. So that's clearly what Article 12 requires, is that you support people to make decisions, and that if you don't have that, your law isn't compliant with the CRPD. And importantly, in respect to Spain, the rationale of the committee for requiring Spain to move beyond limited guardianship was that they had to do so to respect the will and preferences of the person. So that's a very significant. Sinead's going to talk about what the CRPD committee said in relation to Article 19, but that's really important. By way of kind of the international context, I think it's worthwhile to refer also to 2 recent issue papers that were produced by the Council of Europe Commissioner for Human Rights within the last couple of weeks. And the first one, published in February, was on legal capacity, the ability to make decisions, and Article 12. And it made a number of very important recommendations in relation to what members of the Council of Europe had to do in order to comply with it. And it was very much based on an Article 12 approach on supporting people to make decisions. And then the second issue paper, and Sinead might talk about this a little bit more, was that shortly after that they published an issue paper on Article 19. And that's actually very significant because it shows really the synergy between the issues, and that in order really to be able to enjoy your rights under Article 19, to live independently in the community and to be part of the community, that there had to be recognition in law of your decision-making ability. One of the things in our chapter that we've engaged with as well has been a number of recent European Court of Human Rights cases. And the Grand Chamber, in a very significant judgment called Donnell versus Bulgaria, which was issued in January, made some very interesting comments in relation to legal capacity. And really, I suppose the point that we're making is that the European Court of Human Rights really hasn't been a very effective forum in vindicating the rights of persons with disabilities. There has been some successful cases in relation to, and very important cases in relation to challenging detention of people with mental health problems in psychiatric institutions. But it really hasn't been, the European Convention on Human Rights hasn't been effective really for vindicating the rights of people with disabilities in terms of living in institutions. But these decisions actually are very important, Stanov versus Bulgaria and DD versus Lithuania, because what they have done is that they've explicitly used the UN Convention and Article 12 as an interpretive aid in coming to their judgments. And the Stanov judgment really it found a violation of Article 5, which is on the right to liberty. And what was interesting was that there was some discussion around Article 8 and whether Bulgaria had violated the rights of a man who was kept in a social care home against his will under Bulgarian guardianship law. So we think that there is a real potential to use the case law of the European Court of Human Rights, particularly Article 3, Article 5, Article 8, in conjunction with Article 14 on non-discrimination, to advance the rights of persons with disabilities. And it really is bringing, I suppose, scrutiny to institutionalisation, and that there is greater potential for the UN Convention to be to kind of influence the ECHR jurisprudence. I think it's worthwhile to note that in addition to Ireland, a number of countries throughout Europe are looking at reforming their legal capacity laws, in particular Russia, France, Hungary, Latvia, Portugal, Slovakia and Slovenia. So there's a real momentum for change. And if you look at the Czech Republic, they actually introduced a type of supported decision-making law in February, which is interesting. So it shows a trend.
Firstly, I don't agree with the phrase independent living as such, because no one lives completely on their own. and independence kind of leaves you on an island that, and there's very little community participation. So I prefer, if you'll allow, to call it community living. So that's first of all. Second of all, I like to start by saying that I live independently myself, so I have the experience of it. The experience being that, yes, you can say that the article under the CRPD has advanced the right of PWDs, but with one major restriction. Well, one can look at it as a restriction anyway, and that is to say that resources is not mentioned within the CRPD as such when talking about independent living. So that still means that people like my parents will have to come in on weekends to help me substitute my independence by living during the week. So therefore it's not true independence, and it's not true methods of allowing me to make choices that I really want to make. I still think that I have the barrier of familiar living, in that, like, you get up when they do, you go to bed when they do. So first of all, I looked at the committee report on Spain, and Charles might read that out for you. The trouble is that independent living is seen as a social thing, so I can maybe go for coffee with a friend, but nobody asked me how I got up this morning, whether I needed assistance. Like, a lot of people think personal assistance is about helping people outside the house, but a lot of them are daily tasks, like eating breakfast or eating lunch, like they're general tasks that everybody else does, but because you have a disability, it's automatically more difficult, or automatically seen as kind of a social element. So the one thing I would like to see is a Personal Assistance Act, which is in Finland for the last 20 years or more. So that's what I want to see in Ireland, but there's no mention of it in the current Disability Act at all as a form of living. So I think there'd have to be a separate act completely, which defines the role of a PA and actually make it a professional occupation, as opposed to a kind of a stopgap career kind of thing.